Today's first reading, taken from the book of Exodus, we see the institution of that annual sacrifice which the Jewish people celebrated, the institution of that first sacrifice of the Paschal lamb which they offered in Egypt when they were fleeing from the Egyptians, that sacrifice of the lamb whose blood then marked their houses and spared them from the destruction of the Egyptians from whom they fled. If we read on in Exodus in that same chapter, we see how this rite was supposed to be for the Jewish people perpetual. It was a perpetual institution which they had to narrate from generation to generation, father to son. We read further that when children asked their fathers, "What does this mean?" the fathers were to reply to them, "It is the Passover sacrifice for the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck down the Egyptians, and he delivered our houses." And thus it happened from generation to generation. Every year this rite was sacrificed, this lamb was sacrificed, the rite was repeated, the past was remembered. But we have to remember here that it was a symbolic rite that they offered. It was a symbol of the past, which was no longer, and a symbol of the future, which they awaited, a symbol of the future sacrifice, which they perhaps didn't yet have an idea of the sacrifice of our Lord. But it was a symbolic sacrifice. They lived a symbol and not a reality. Now, when our Lord came and fulfilled the symbolism, fulfilled the law, offered the sacrifice of the new and everlasting covenant, he too said, "Do this in memory of me." He too told the church, commanded the church to offer the same sacrifice until the end of time. But we, in our offering the true and everlasting sacrifice of the body and blood of our Lord at every Mass, we can kind of fall into the way of thinking of a symbolic celebration. We too can be tempted to live the Mass just as a symbol, just as a remembrance of something that happened in the past. At least in our way of praying when we participate in Mass, perhaps we're tempted to think how great it would have been if we had only been on Calvary. How privileged was Our Lady there at the foot of the cross to stand on Calvary, St. John, the evangelist, St. Mary Magdalene. If only we could have been there too, at least like the good thief, to ask our Lord forgiveness. If only we had been so privileged. And poor us who don't have such a grace. Such a way of thinking can taint our prayer. Poor us that don't have such a grace. So here, let's listen to the words of St. John Paul II. In a memorable little speech of his, he reminds us of what the Mass is for us Catholics. St. John Paul II, quote, "The sacrifice of the cross is so decisive for the future of man that Christ did not carry it out and did not return to the Father until he had left us the means to take part in it as if we had been present. The Mass and the cross are but one and the same sacrifice. The Eucharistic breaking of the bread has an essential function, that of putting at our disposal the original offering of the cross. By making the body and blood of Christ really present under the appearances of bread and wine, it makes at the same time the sacrifice of the cross actual and accessible to our generation, the sacrifice which remains in its uniqueness, the turning point of the history of salvation, the essential link between time and eternity." Our Lord, unlike the original sacrifice of the Lamb, which was just a prefiguration of our Lord's sacrifice, our Lord, when he instituted his sacrifice, did not do so without leaving us a means of participating in it ourselves by making it accessible to our generation, to us who are celebrating the Mass right now. The cross and the Mass are but one sacrifice, and we Catholics can't remind ourselves of this enough. Our Mass is Calvary. Our Mass is Calvary. We don't live a mere symbol, a mere empty commemoration, a ritual remembrance like that of the Jewish people. Our Mass is actually Calvary, and that's why we go to Mass. That's really why we go to Mass. Sometimes our human faith is put to the test. Our human faith that Mass is Calvary is put to the test. We don't go there for the singing. Hopefully we like the singing, but sometimes we don't. Hopefully we like the people that we find at Mass. Sometimes we don't, but we don't go there for that. Hopefully the priest is likable. Hopefully he somehow incarnates Christ for us, the faithful, but sometimes he doesn't, and I apologize. But we don't go there for that. We don't go there for human elements. We go there for the essence of the Mass, which is the renewal, the perpetuation of the sacrifice of Calvary. So that's the way we have to live our Mass. Our Lord came to fulfill the law, to institute a new law, an eternal law, a new and everlasting sacrifice, which is present to us. Which is present to us if we have the faith to see it. So let's live the Mass for what it really is, the sacrifice of our Lord on Calvary. Let's participate in it fully, especially by receiving our Lord's precious body and blood. Our Lord's precious body and blood, which saves us from what? From all the temptations that assail us from the world, the flesh and the devil. If the prefiguration, the sacrifice of the Lamb, was able to spare the Jewish people from the extermination of the Egyptians, how much more?